This is TWiT.
Big Android news this week, which Android's, close to my heart, so I'm always watching it closely. But this is a very interesting story. Android is pretty used to getting a bad rap when it comes to platform security. There are stories all the time about how this thing was hacked or that app was, let's say, devious or mischievous in some way. That might be putting it lightly. Let's just say it's hard to surprise when it comes to new Android security threats. But a new Buzzfeed investigation reveals a devious ad fraud scheme that is impressive in its depth and its approach. Joining us to discuss the report is Craig Silverman, who wrote about it for Buzzfeed. Welcome, Craig.
Hello, thank you.
It's great to have you here. So, first of all, what exactly clued you guys into this elaborate scheme? There's a whole lot of machinations going on here. It's pretty complicated how it's all set up. What kind of drew you into this to begin with?
It is a pretty big and sophisticated scheme. The first tip-off that I got to it was back in June. A company that helps detect ad fraud by the name of Pixelate had actually discovered an initial, what turned out to be a small part of this larger fraud scheme, where they found one app called Megacast had basically been pretending to be other apps in order to get advertising that people thought they would be placing on those. And then after they sort of published their investigation, I dug in a little bit more to see, well, what's the next level here? And it turned out that a lot of these apps that they thought had actually been victims were in fact connected through corporate ownership, IP addresses, a whole range of different things that we started to find as we investigated. And it just got bigger and bigger and bigger to the point where ultimately I was able to find about more than 125 Android apps, as well as some video websites that were all connected in this one large scheme.
So talking about the large scheme, you actually detail it pretty well in your article, the order of events as far as kind of the strategy, as it were, around this ad fraud, from acquiring these companies to kind of training bots and everything. Talk a little bit about that process and why it's so different.
Yeah, I mean it's kind of deviously clever, right? The way they went about it. So the first step is that, of course, there's lots of independent developers or small companies building Android apps. And so what these folks did was they had kind of a third party called We Purchase Apps. And We Purchase Apps would approach these developers and say, hey, I'd like to purchase your app.
Weird.
And in a lot of cases, these weren't super popular apps. They weren't doing a lot of monetization, if at all. And so they would offer these developers what was a really good price for those apps. And the developers would be like, oh, this is great, And so the app would get sold. And then pretty soon the app would be put into the Play Store under a different developer's name. And these were shell companies that were registered in places like Bulgaria or Cyprus or Malta. And from there, what the fraudsters would do is they would study the existing human audience that was already in there. So the real people who downloaded the app, the real people who were using it, and they looked at their behavior, where they clicked, how long they spent on the app, where in the world they were coming from, all that kind of stuff. And then they would train bots to mimic this. So in effect, they were tracking user behavior to then train bots to mimic those humans. And of course, if you throw the bots in along with the humans, then it's disguised. You don't know what's real and what's fake. So that evades some of the fraud detection. And of course, then you can start earning a whole lot more money than before because you're able to basically fabricate as much audience as you want.
Wow.
Okay, so the developers who sold their apps, they got money for their apps. They were actually paid. And then most of these apps were free to download, or if the customer paid for the app, the app worked as promised. So they got what they were getting. And the advertisers paid Google. So Google got what it was promised. So the real victim here is the advertisers.
Yeah, so that's the thing with digital ad fraud, and I've spent about a year now publishing investigations into it. First of all, it's massive. There's roughly about $19 billion or more that will be stolen this year. Like, not ads that sort of didn't work or were misplaced, 100% stolen. And so in this case, and in ad fraud in general, you have all these players in the supply chain, everybody who's getting paid as they take their little piece as, the money flows from a brand all the way into an app or a website. And you're right, at the end of the day, whose money is it? It's the money of the people who are trying to place advertising. So big brands, small, medium-sized companies who spent money, but along the way, instead of showing it to a real audience, it actually ended up being shown to bots or in some other way fraudulent. And that money, unless it's exposed, that money is gone forever. In this case, Google says that on their ad networks alone, about $10 million was stolen. So now they're figuring out how to kind of refund that money.
Now, $10 million on their ads alone, but that you also point out in the article that that's like potentially that's like a tenth of what was actually stolen here, right? This could amount to way more money when all things are investigated.
Yeah. So at one point there was kind of an inside source who had told Pixelate, who had estimated that, this one attack they found in June, they thought, oh, that could steal about $75 million a year. And then this source, who was from a company deeply involved in the scheme, actually emailed them and said, hey, it's probably about 10 times that. So the estimate from an insider is that it's hundreds of millions of dollars. But I'll tell you, here's the thing that I've experienced, which is that nobody wants to admit how much money has been stolen. So I give Google some credit. They actually stood up and they published a blog post and they said how much money they think it was. But none of the other ad networks that were helping monetize this traffic have stood up and said that. In fact, most of the responses I'm getting are them saying it was very small. So according to them, nobody lost any money, which doesn't make any sense at all.
So let's talk a little bit about the apps that are kind of involved here and whether the developers themselves, the original developers, like whether there may have ever been any sort of clues to them whatsoever. You said they were kind of small-time developers, although one of the apps, I think, had a pretty big kind of following and then went away. And then what do you know? It came back in a magical sort of way because it had been acquired here. Like, are these apps that the majority of people have never heard of, or are they more popular than that?
So there is a mix. I mean, overall, when I totaled it up, these apps have been installed more than 115 million times. So cumulatively, we're talking about a lot of installs. Yeah. The biggest app, the one that you mentioned, was one called Everything Me, which is actually still in the Play Store. And so that one was a very popular app, had actually won a Webby, was featured by Google. But then the really hot startup behind it went out of business. And what happened was in about 2016, somebody came along and kind of quietly bought it up and put it back in the Play Store. And so for the most part, you're looking at apps that have about 500,000, 1 million, 2, 3, 4 million installs. And then there were a couple of outliers where you had more than 5 million, more than 10 million installs. And for the purposes of doing something like this, you don't want to attract too much attention to yourself. So having lots of shell companies to spread the apps around sort of distributes your risk, and also making sure that you aren't running apps that are super duper popular where people are really exercising a lot of scrutiny over who you are, and Google really wants to pay attention to you. So getting that middle of the road popularity, I think, really helped them in the end.
There seems to be, and this is such a smart scam. There seems to be a lot of knowledge of how the App Store works, how the review process works. This Everything Me, like I felt like I remembered this app, so I looked it up. And the first link when you look it up on Google is, how sad it is that this app went out of business because people loved it so much. So it seems like they really might have gone after, okay, here's a pretty popular app that never figured out how to make money to survive. And so we can figure out how to make money to survive by being very clever and also breaking the law. But knowing that Google doesn't go back and check to see if you've continued to follow their rules. Like, do you think these people are in the ad business to know so much?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, in the story, I've actually identified 4 people who are key beneficiaries of this. 2 of them used to run a hosting company, so they have the experience, running, setting up, administrating servers, which you need in order to, to set up the bots and run the bots. Another one was somebody who had been distributing software that was classified as PUP. So on the edge of it being malware, stuff that would get on people's computers and they wouldn't know how to uninstall. And then, the 4th one was somebody who actually is a huge shareholder in a mobile apps development company based in Serbia. So when you put all the 4 of them together, they have the experience in advertising. They have the experience, with servers and databases, and they actually have a mobile apps development studio up and running. So all the pieces were there.
And is this the kind of thing, like I said, kind of in the intro of this story, we're so used to hearing about this and that bad thing as related to Android. Is this the kind of thing that could only happen on the Android OS, or could this very, very easily happen on iOS as well or other mobile platforms?
You know, a lot of the experts that I spoke to about this, and I think you talked about it a little bit off the top. You know, they do say that the Android ecosystem is, you know, one of the benefits, I guess, of it is that it's open. It's kind of easier to work with if you're a developer, I suppose. But of course, that increases the amount of risks and threats for the potential end user. And so I do think that it's not an accident that they were only working in Android. Obviously, for them, it makes sense to focus on one mobile ecosystem and just develop for Android rather than mixing and having to find different skill sets for that. But overall, the experts I spoke to, they do feel that Apple does a better job with security review initially as apps get into its app store and then on an ongoing basis. And, you know, the reality is these apps, they changed owners, you know, different code was put into them. There's a lot about these apps that changed over time, but they never really flagged, you know, the right things at Google for Google to re-review them and take a look at what they were doing. And so they got away with it.
Mm-hmm.
So today you posted another piece that Senator Mark Warner, based on your research into this, is trying to encourage the FTC to go after digital ad fraud. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so the senator is somebody who actually, I'll give him credit. He was sending letters to the FTC back in 2016 about ad fraud. So he's somewhat of an old hand at this, and he raised the issue then that, you know, this is stealing a lot of money, as I mentioned earlier, this year, about $19 billion. And it goes up every single year. So the industry is not stopping it from happening, and nobody is getting fired and nobody is going to jail over this. And so he's telling the FTC, we need to look at this. And one of the things that's interesting is he relates it kind of to the Russian interference in the 2016 election. He says, you know, some people are exploiting ad tech, bots, trolls, social networks to sow political division and spread disinformation, but other people are exploiting it to steal money. And so he's calling on the FTC to spend more time and more attention on this. And he's also pretty hard on Google, saying that, you know, perhaps they're not knowingly engaging in this. He said, you know, there is no evidence of that, but he accuses them of having a willful blindness to allow this to take place, because in some cases, you know, they are actually earning money from it.
Yeah, that's really indicative of the lens through which more and more people are looking at stories like this, right? Like 2 years ago, maybe the ire would not be directed as severely on a large company like Google. But right now, man, you know, we're firmly in kind of this sea change that's happening, where people are looking at these large tech companies differently and realizing, hey, it's actually quite convenient for you to not, you know, to create these tools and not really do as much as maybe you should be doing to clamp down on this, because in the end, it makes you a lot of money.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's a fair point. It's a fair point to question, you know, what the incentives are for these companies to really dig into this. And I think it's fair to point out that right now, Senator Warner and others in the government aren't too happy with Google, because while other companies like Facebook and Twitter have sent their CEOs to go and testify on Capitol Hill, Google has resisted that, and the Senate and the House committees are not happy about that.